Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon and welcome to this Fundación Telefónica space and this new edition of Vida, Martes. For me, it is quite funny to see it from here because quite frequently I just see it from the other side. When they proposed to me to actually conduct the interview with Andrés Rojo and Andrew Solomon, it really made me restless, and I'll tell you why. How to introduce a writer who, with two of his writing, Far from the Tree and Noonday Demon, has made us reflect and even reevaluate huge and enormously important issues such as depression with all the social stigma linked to it, and what's even harsher, the relationship between mothers and fathers with children that suffer autism, who are hearing impaired, that have developmental issues, that have Down syndrome. You have your own job and you think about obvious things, right? Okay, it's a professor. He has written reputable books. He's been awarded with great recognitions. But when I thought about doing that type of presentation, I thought it would be like treason. Because if something really characterizes Andrew Solomon is that he speaks, and I haven't finished both books yet, but he speaks of love, he speaks of pain, and even, I would dare say, he speaks of faith. And there I was, in the sea of indecision, when all of a sudden, two verses appeared before me. Edward Cott, who said, more or less in August, when I was 14 years old, I lost myself somewhere in a hill. Being 14, 25, or 53, in August, or in May, February, who hasn't at some point got lost? Who at some point is still not lost? The good thing is that Andrew Solomon, with his titanic and passionating works, manages to shed some light on our many darknesses. He brings light to us. Questions are brought by Andrés Rojo. He's a journalist of the opinions section in the newspaper El País. I owe some thanks to José Andrés, and he didn't know about it. He was the director of Babelia, and many of the books that I actually purchased are his suggestions, and I have no complaint. So he works in the opinions section of El País in Babelia. He's head of culture. He's written many books, one about Peter Gabriel that I particularly like, but especially one which is something that he really likes. Andrés Rojo, a portrait of a Republican captain. And apart from those things, what are we going to have here? Well, Sherlock Holmes had some irregulars in Baker Street. We have our group of Martians. They are young people whose ages range from 14 to 16 years of age. And they are players in the digital area, and they will give us their point of view. And they will talk about the issues that we're about to tackle here. We're in Fundación Telefónica, so please do not turn off your cell phones. Just turn off the volume, okay? Turn down the volume, and please use social networks. Harness the moment. Passionate yourselves, and most importantly, please remember you can ask questions through this hashtag Vida Martes. Questions will be displayed on the screen, and as much as we possibly can, we will answer all the questions. So now, Andrew Solomon, Mr. Rojo. Good afternoon. Good evening. I would like to thank Random House Mondadora and Fundación Telefónica for having invited me and for giving me the opportunity to talk to Andrew Solomon, to ask him questions. I really hope I'm up to the task, up to the level of these two great books that actually deal with extremely delicate issues. Since the very beginning, I thought, well, how are we going to gather in this more or less public place talking about things which are so personal? Quite probably because allow me to use a metaphor. If the soul of man, if man actually were a branch, a small branch on a tree, what Andrew Solomon's works are actually about what happens when something breaks that branch. Everything revolves roughly around that breach, around that broken branch. In that branch of depression, this break has to do with the break of the flow of life, because we no longer really fit with the world and we get depressed. It's a matter of heartbreak, I'd say. And in another case, the break happens because of the continuum between parents and children that's broken, that doesn't really flow. So there's that snap. So I am under the impression that we need to talk about such intimate breaks, and I have the feeling that we need to lower our voices to create that environment so that I can start asking you, Andrew, let's start talking about depression. What happens there? At what moment does that happen? Quite often, people who are depressed don't really know what's going on with them. They cannot articulate what they're feeling. They take steps back. They don't really look into the future. Why did you come up with this idea? Why at a given moment you started talking about this issue?
Well, I always say that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And that the state of being depressed is a state in which the basic energy one needs to live seems to disappear. Everything begins to seem difficult. Everything begins to seem uninteresting. Everything begins to feel heavy and burdensome. I remember when I was depressed, I would be at the point at which I thought, gee, I should get up and have something to eat. And I would think, but I would have to go into the kitchen and take the food out and put it on a plate, and cut it up, and chew it, and swallow it. And that simple, straightforward activity began to feel to me like the Stations of the Cross. I didn't know how anyone could do it. And one of the things that often gets lost in descriptions of depression is that you know that it's ridiculous when you're in it. You know that people all over are getting up and eating something and getting out and taking care of the day, and that it isn't that difficult. And yet, even though rationally you know it's not that difficult, it feels so heavy. And then, after a period of that, often what sets in is a sense of pain, a sense of it being so anguishing simply to be alive, of every gesture and everything you do seeming to hurt you more in this strange, ineffable way. And often it's at that point that the anxiety sets in. And I've sometimes said that if you told me I had to be anxious for the rest of this month, I would say, okay. Sorry, if you said I had to be depressed for the rest of this month, I would say, okay, as long as it will end by the end of February, I'll do it. But if you said I had to have acute anxiety for the rest of the month, I would say I can't. I just can't, because the sense of fear is so overwhelming. And so I think depression really is all of those things. You may feel very sad when you're depressed, and it's not unrelated to sadness, but it's not primarily an experience of sadness. It's primarily an experience of losing the will and the ability to go on being alive.
I had taken some notes, actually 2 words I had written down in order to trigger, to spark this first approximation to the talk. One is the word breach, and the other one is to go astray. When you live a process of depression is like something is broken, right? Something snaps. And it's very difficult to put those things together, those things that previously apparently flowed naturally. And because they no longer flow naturally, you're going astray. You cannot find a sense in what you do. And there are two key elements, I'd say. Apparently something that's exclusively related with your mood. Nevertheless, it has a deep impact on the body. And it is no longer something of the spirit only. It starts hurting here or there or over there. How do we live through that? And how do we battle it? How do we fight it? Because sometimes there are drugs that can help us get out of that point. So how does that crack happen? And how can we find the adequate direction again so that we no longer go astray?
There has been a debate about what depression really is since, for thousands of years. In 500 BC, Hippocrates described depression in almost the exact same terms that we would use for it today. And he said it was an organic dysfunction of the brain that could be treated with oral remedies. So though he didn't have antidepressants, he had the idea of antidepressants. And Plato said that it was a philosophical problem that could be resolved only through dialogue and discourse. So while he didn't have the methodologies of current psychiatric psychotherapies, he had the idea of them. So that question goes back for a very long way. Now, a lot of people have tried to say it's really chemical, or it's really psychological or psychodynamic. And the problem is that these seem as though they're opposing sides and they're locked in opposition to each other. They're actually different vocabularies for the same set of phenomena. You could describe the education that most of the people in this room probably have in biological terms if we were only sophisticated enough to chart its location in the brain. And you likewise could take anything that is being said here that upsets you, and you can think of it as an experience, and if it suddenly causes a surge of chemicals in your brain, you can experience that. There's a great deal of scope for understanding everything as both biological and psychological. And sometimes people make the mistake of saying, but my depression really comes out of my life experience, so I have to treat it with things that relate to my life experience. Or people saying, my depression really comes out of something strange and chemical, so I have to treat it chemically. That's not an appropriate equivalence. You might have terrible depression because you were a soldier who served in the Iraq War, and you saw horrible things, and you saw friends die, and you had to kill people. And when you got back, you were so devitalized that you couldn't get out of bed, and the drugs might very well help you. And you could equally be going about your regular life and suddenly feel absolutely terrible and think it must be a chemical surge in my brain, and still be helped by dialogue and discourse, by psychotherapy, by human interaction. So what is the best way to approach depression? I think depression is in some ways like having a cough. If you have a cough, you might be coughing because you have a cold. You might be coughing because the person next to you is smoking a cigarette. You might be coughing because you have lung cancer. There are 100 different reasons why you might be coughing. And in the same way, depression is the common endpoint of many different experiences. It's what happens finally after a variety of processes that may come before it. And if we try to say, you should treat depression this way, we're denying that complexity. And in addition, we're denying what is perhaps the most fundamental complexity and the one so often missed, which is that there is always an interaction between illness and personality. And one person can experience a great deal of pain and be less debilitated by it than another person. We see that all the time with physical pain. It's true with psychic pain as well. And the personality and the illness are constantly interacting with each other. And we can never come up with a single solution that fully countenances the complexity of that interaction. We have to support the nature of someone's inherent personality, and we have to address the invasive intrusion of that person's mental illness.
Acaba de hablar de...
You just talked about radical experiences of pain, of suffering, combat, death. But quite often depressions happen in the big city, where nothing really happens that's so striking. You haven't seen a drop of blood, and apparently you should be enchanted with life. Everything smiles at you, advanced societies provide a great deal of comfort. Nevertheless, all of a sudden you crumble and you lose track of your references. There's an image that you portray on your book, which is Virginia Woolf, when she didn't even want to feed herself. She didn't want to eat anything. She just wanted to let go of herself. What happens in those radical moments of abandonment, of self-abandonment? And here I would like to introduce, in a way, the point that, well, often we're talking about life and death. Always in deep tear, there's that temptation of suicide, right? Abandonment, suicide. How do we fight that? How do you gather your weapons? And then that second element, how is it possible? Actually, in the book, you say, do this era, do this time. And you love this era, right? You love this time. You would have loved to have been born in other points of history, but you love the challenges that we're facing, and apparently everything's crumbling down, but you actually love this. So how do you face the world when you've lost all your references, when there's no going forward?
Saying that people often underestimate the ubiquity of depression. People don't understand how often it occurs or how many people it affects. And you're absolutely right. On the one hand, it affects the soldier back from Iraq who has suffered terribly and who somehow can explain the origin of his depression. But it also affects ordinary people. It probably affects quite a few of the people in this room tonight. It affects a lot of the people you'll see when you walk out onto the street this evening. When you write a book like the one I've written, it's almost as though you've been given a pair of X-ray goggles or one of those machines they use at the airport that allows you to see inside of people. Because people had said to me, oh, if you write about your depression, don't you feel people will look down at you or that they'll laugh at you? And my experience contrary is that if you write about and speak about your depression, one by one, almost everyone you know comes and says, I've been taking some medication, I don't know if I'm on the right thing. Or says, I'm worried about my mother, she's getting old and she seems very withdrawn, I don't know what to do. Or says, my best friend's son killed himself and I don't know what to say about it. And directly or indirectly, everyone has been touched by this situation. It's not foreign to anyone, despite the cheerful faces that you see much of the time. And I don't mean to say it's the only reality. People also are very cheerful. In fact, when I'm not depressed, I think I'm quite a cheerful and joyful person. But there is no question that it can weigh very heavily. You ask about this point that people come to, the point of suicide, the point of this complete despair. I've had a very interesting experience over the years of on various occasions talking to people who have made a suicide attempt and have survived. And when I talk to them, they describe being at a point at which what they were doing felt to them completely logical. And you say, but didn't you know how much pain you would cause to the people around you? And didn't you know that it was possible to get better? And didn't you know that there are always thousands of other solutions to any problem other than killing yourself? And people say, no, in that moment, I felt it was the only possibility. It was the only thing that made sense. One of the most sinister aspects of depression is that the distortions it provides to one's reality feel more authentic than the things that one has perceived when one is well. So you don't feel in depression that you've put on a gray veil and that you're seeing everything through the haze of your bad mood. You feel that a veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. And it's very difficult to deal with that. As one of the people I interviewed said, when I was depressed, a lot of what I was seeing was the truth, but the truth lies. And I was very taken with that idea of a truth that lies, and by this person Maggie Robbins' description of a truth that lies, which is to say that when you're very depressed you think, but there's no point to anything because in the end we're all just going to die anyway, and no two human beings fully know each other, and the human condition is to be alone. And what you need to say to someone who's depressed is not, that isn't true, because actually that is true. What you have to say is, all of that is true, but it's a beautiful day today, and I've got some delicious cheese we can have for lunch. And that actually is in many ways equally important. And I'll sort of close that thought by quoting a study which I became quite obsessed with, in which a group of depressed and a group of non-depressed people were all asked to play a video game for 45 minutes. And at the end of 45 minutes they were asked, how many little monsters do you think you killed? And the depressed people were mostly accurate to within about 10%. And the non-depressed people mostly guessed between 12 and 15 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. And I think what it reveals is that having a completely clear and accurate perception of things in the way that many depressed people perceive themselves to be doing isn't always an advantage, and that actually people who are healthy have a little protective coating of optimism, and it's part of what makes us able to go on with life as human beings.
Me gustaría que hablar.
I would like you to talk about your experience in Cambodia. We've talked about that nearby depression, the one that happens in our societies. But what happens in those faraway places, in those places where they've lived a social trauma of the size that, of the importance that they had over there with the red germs? Actually, 20% of the population was swept off. There were massacres that were terrible. Are they different? The ones that are over there, are they different from ours? What are the differences? How do they suffer depression? Is their depression different from the one that could be suffered by a gentleman that lives quietly in Madrid and that has a full-time job and things go well for him?
My primary objectives in writing this book was to break down the idea that depression is a modern, Western, middle-class or upper-class illness, by showing that it has existed historically. I already mentioned Hippocrates. By saying that it exists across the socioeconomic spectrum, and that while poor people are less likely to identify themselves as depressed, they are not less likely to be depressed, and by showing that it exists in every society in the world. And to that end, I looked at depression among the Greenlandic Inuit. I looked at depression rituals for the treatment of depression in West Africa, and I went to Cambodia to look at the issue of depression in the wake of a national catastrophe, in that case, in the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge. And what I found was that the language people use to describe depression varies a great deal. Their sense of what an appropriate intervention is and how to fix depression may vary a great deal. The syndrome itself is surprisingly consistent, and eventually you manage to translate among these languages. So you asked in particular about Cambodia. In Cambodia, I got to know, through fortunate coincidence, a woman who had been herself chased during the Khmer Rouge period, had gone through hideous difficulties, had seen one daughter raped and murdered, had had a baby who starved to death because she was in the jungle and couldn't get enough nutrition to produce breast milk, had been through awful, awful things, but who then ended up in one of the refugee camps at the Thai border. And when she was in that refugee camp, she noticed that there were all these women who had somehow survived those terrible years, but who now were just sitting there, staring into space, not taking care of themselves, not taking care of their children. And she went to the aid workers because she was a relatively educated woman who could communicate easily with them. And she said, what are we to do with these women? And the aid workers said, we are having a very hard time controlling infectious diseases in this camp, and we don't have time to deal with that. And she thought, well, then I have to do something. And she said it took her a long time to figure it out, but what she eventually came up with was that she would go into, get these women to begin to think and talk about something other than what had happened to them. She said, by filling their minds with something current, I was teaching them to forget, because to forget was the first step they needed in the course of healing. And after I had taught them to forget, I would try to train them in some skill, even if it was only to be cleaning a house, because they had to have some kind of work. Because if you had work, it gave you purpose, and that helped you with the depression. She said, and then I would teach them to perform manicures and pedicures. And I said, I beg your pardon. And she said, what people lost most during this period at the Khmer Rouge was the ability to trust one another. She said, and I would invite these women into the hut I had, and I would fill it with steam, and they would have a chance to think about being beautiful, which they had not been able to think about for so many years, and they would hold out their hands to one another, to somebody else with a very sharp implement in her hand. She said, and so they began to break down those physical barriers that prevented them from trusting. She said, and when I had taught them these three things, to forget, to work, and to trust, then I tried to teach them that those are not three separate things, but three parts of a single way of being in the world. And when they understood that, they were ready to go on with their lives again. And I met many of the women she had treated in this way, who said that she had saved their lives, and they were so grateful that they wanted to do something for her, and at first she didn't know what to do with them, and in the end she built an orphanage completely staffed by these women whom she had helped, all of whom felt that there they could teach on to somebody else. So is that the same as psychotherapy as it's practiced in the streets of major Western capitals? No, it's very different, and yet the problem being addressed is the same problem, and in some ways the essence of the treatment borrows from a great deal of the same psychology.
Vamos a saltar un poco y...
We are going to jump a little bit. We're going to steer away from depression. And now, far from the tree, we are going to tend to those fruits that don't fall near the tree, but are actually very far away from the tree and are somehow too far away from the trunk. So this talks about how our identity is formed. Identity happens vertically because we have our parents, our mother, our father, and we inherit their customs, their habits, the way they perceive things, and we tread a way that has been reestablished, so to speak. But what happens when there's a crack, when there's that breach? What happens when the son or the child doesn't construct references vertically in relationship with his or her parents, but vertically rather, having as reference the group of friends or people that they feel that they belong to, people that resemble them. We're talking here about people who have Down syndrome, autism, people who are homosexuals, when actually the expectations of the father was or mother was for them to be heterosexual. These are identities that are created in a nearby group and not vertically so much. These are many elements, and there are many cases that you deal with in the book. But I would like to talk first about a very general question. There's a point in the book in which you talk about when you discover that you're gay, you try to reinvent yourself. How am I? How do I reinvent myself? How does conflict happen when there's that break with parents? How do you steer away from that break? And then we'll ask the next question, but let's have this as the starting question.
When I was a child and began to realize that I might be gay, I was deeply upset. I was upset because I thought it would be a disappointment to my parents. I was upset because gay people seemed to be marginalized. It was at that time that Time magazine ran an article that said homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life that deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's the world that I was born into. And so I had a sense of this tragedy. I think the defining element of the tragedy was the sense that as a gay person I would never be able to have a family. And I felt, because I was very close to my family of origin, I felt that what I wanted most in the world was to be able to grow up and have a marriage and have children. And for a long time I felt I had to make this terrible choice between having that thing that mattered so much to me and having my integrity as a human being. And I couldn't decide which to do. And I went out with men and I went out with women, and I had this involvement and I had that involvement, and I pulled back and forth between the two things. And I got bullied and teased as a child, as gay children do, and I had the sense that somehow I had failed in some very central part of life, and that I came from a world that valued success, and that I was not successful in this way. And then the world slowly changed, and now there is gay marriage, and now gay people are socially accepted. And now, as I could not have imagined when I was 12 or 14 years old, I'm actually quite comfortable sitting here in front of all of you and talking about who I am and telling you that I ultimately found a marriage and did have children and have had, in many ways, really a very good experience in my adulthood. And the sort of premise from which this book began is that I was born with an illness, and as an adult I have an identity. And how did that happen? How did an illness become an identity? And if the illness of homosexuality could become the identity of gayness, then what other illnesses were there that might be waiting to go through this transformation and to become identities? And I thought, if I managed to live through this change, are there other changes that I could help other people to live through and allow them to have a sense of themselves not as broken, but actually as whole and as different?
There is a great dilemma that arises among these people that are part of a certain group, and they're somehow outside of the mainstream. And you talk about this when you talk about the hearing impaired. What is better for a person that's hearing impaired? And you ponder being marginal in a mainstream world, that is to say, being outside of the rest of people, being beyond the rest of people, or being mainstream in a marginal world. Which of these options provides more happiness? Is this an option that all these people will have to ponder? People who have autism, Down syndrome, schizophrenic people, do they have to ponder these options? Or is there no such question in reality?
Question in reality, without question. I must say I was very pleased to see that there's a sign interpreter today. I love the idea of whatever I'm working on being accessible to the people about whom I have written. I looked a lot at family because the defining quality, as you said in your first question, of the conditions I was looking at is that they're conditions that parents and children don't share. Now, there are many identities that parents and children do share, and you could say that some of them are very difficult identities. You know, it is easier in Europe and in the US to be a white person than to be a black person. But there's nobody trying to cure blackness or make it go away. People aren't trying to figure out some way to ensure that the next generation of children born to parents from Africa come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. And there is always an emphasis on cure when it's a condition that the parent and the child don't have in common, because the parents tend to think that their lives, which they generally perceive to be normal, are somehow easier and better than this strange and different life on which their child is embarking. And so they often want to involve themselves in this protectiveness. Now, parenting always involves two urgent tasks. One is that we change our children. We educate them. We try to give them a sense of moral values. Perhaps we teach them about faith. Perhaps we try to teach them some manners. We do all of these things to change our children, and not to change our children is neglect. But the other component of parenting is to recognize our children for who they are, and to engage with who they are, and to give them a sense that they are accepted, and even that they are celebrated, and that who they are is wonderful in the eyes of their parents, and can be wonderful in the eyes of other people out in the world. And some things clearly need to be changed, and some things clearly need to be celebrated, and many things fall in a gray middle. And the topic of the book, in many ways, is how families negotiate that gray middle, and how do you make those choices. So if you have a child, for instance, who's born with deafness, do you want to teach that child to read lips and to develop oral speech? Well, those can be very useful skills. Do you want to get your child a cochlear implant, which is a device surgically implanted in the brain that allows sound information to bypass the structures of the ear so that the person can function in the hearing world? That often can be very helpful, but it doesn't always work as well as it might. Do you want your child to have access to the signing world and to be able to participate in that culture of signed language? Well, that too can have a great deal of value. My belief in terms of what parents need to do is that you should try to preserve the largest number of options possible for your child. If one of my children had been born deaf, I think I would have gotten a cochlear implant, and I would have ensured that my child spent a lot of time in a signing environment so that the decision was one the child could make as the child moved on toward consciousness. But when you look at these situations, do I as an individual want to choose to be, as you put it, or I think as I put it, but as you quoted, to be marginal in a mainstream world or mainstream in a marginal world? You know, those are complicated choices, and ultimately, I think it's not an either-or. I think there are many people who have got a big role in the world of their difference and an ability to interact with a world that finds them foreign. So I think, for example, of one of the dwarfs I got to know, who's a guy named Clinton Brown, who has diastrophic dwarfism. He's only 3 feet tall. He's had many, many challenges. He is very involved in a group called the Little People of America. He has a lot of dwarf friends. He just recently got engaged. The woman he's planning to marry is a dwarf, though she's much taller than he is. 3 feet is less than a meter, I should say, less than a meter tall. And so he has that world in which he sort of plays a big role, but he also is friends with me and comes to dinner at our house and is part of our life. And I think part of what's happened in recent years, and part of what I hope this book will press forward, is the idea that difference doesn't need to result in isolation. Depression is a disease of loneliness. Deafness, dwarfism, gayness, those don't have to be conditions of loneliness. It's not built into them.
There is a sentence that I would like to portray so that we can make some room for other questions. But there's a point in this book in which you actually say it is vital to be truthful to our lives with all the challenges, limitations, and specificities in it. I feel that this engine is the one that actually gears all that set, that myriad of stories that you've gathered in your books. You did confess that at some point you wanted to be a novelist. And one is under the impression that in the end you finished up telling stories, multiple stories, real life stories, laden with conflicts. But this is what novel writers do, right? It's to talk about limit situations and see how you respond when you're in them. Actually, when you talk about Down syndrome, I was thinking just now about how terrible it is for a parent, because parents normally try to push their children forward, right? So that they can hop on clouds and they can do great and huge projects. But when you have a Down syndrome child that wants to drive, and all of a sudden the parent has to convince the Down children's child as to the fact that they cannot drive, how difficult it is to actually bring them down instead of making them rise. And the full book is packed with this type of stories. why don't we close this topic with the following question? What has been your experience as a writer? What did you finally wanted to talk about? What are the great issues that you wanted to put on the table? Issues about life, about human beings. At the end of the day, the very fact of writing.
The ultimate message, I suppose, if one is going to try to reduce two rather chunky books to an ultimate message, is that I've been amazed by the extent of human resilience, that many of the families I interviewed for Far From the Tree, when they found out what was wrong with their children, were utterly horrified and wished that they didn't have to deal with this. And those families, in most instances, certainly not in every one, ended up becoming deeply, deeply attached to those children, to the point where they would say to me that they wouldn't want to imagine any other life that didn't include those exact children. And at first I thought, that's ridiculous. Of course you would want a life that didn't include those children. And then I thought, all of us who have children who are flawed. And if some glorious angel dropped through the ceiling of the Fundación Telefónica and offered all the parents in this room the opportunity to exchange their children for other better children who were more intelligent and more attractive and more polite, people would cling to the children they have and pray away that atrocious spectacle. And we are attached to our children. We not only take care of them because we love them, we also love them because we take care of them. And the intensity of care that these situations have required is often the basis of a profound bond. Would we like to spare our children certain kinds of suffering? Yes. Would we like to spare ourselves some kinds of suffering or even some kinds of embarrassment? Yes, I think we often would. But what was striking to me was how much resilience people found in these situations, and how often people expressed gratitude, how often people who were depressed said, I didn't want to be depressed and I wouldn't do it if I had any choice, but it's made me kinder, it's made me more humane, it's made me better able to interact with other people, it's made me appreciate the days when I'm not depressed. One of the people I interviewed said, understanding how distorted your thinking can get has made it possible for me to tolerate the evil in the world. And these parents, over and over again, of these children who were different, came out with very much the same ultimate message. There's one of them who had a child with very severe disabilities who died tragically through caregiver neglect. And at his funeral she said, let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed. Once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved. One other mother, who also had children who had very severe disabilities and who didn't survive very long, said, people always give us these little sayings, like God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. Now, I don't want to trivialize the anguish that's involved in any of these stories. Depression, Down syndrome, children who commit crimes, families bring up children conceived in rape, all these things I've looked at. I wouldn't diminish that suffering, but I believe that it is possible, at least when you're out of the very worst of it, to make that choice and to locate some kind of meaning in it, and that the process of doing that is really the essence of love. And that was the topic of both of the books. Thank you. Thank you.
Hasta aquí la...
This has been the first part, and now my function as a conductor, as a moderator, would be to play the cards, to deal the cards. But I cannot resist, since I have the microphone, to ask a question to Mr. Solomon. I have things of you that none of my friends would have told me. I have many close friends who are from the Basque Country. We say I love you by eating a big steak. So my question is, vulnerability, that is to say, confessing the things that you actually confess, is it a strength?
Strength, but I think it probably requires some strength to do it. I grew up with a big secret. I was very closeted about the fact that I was gay, and I didn't want anyone to know. And when I finally decided that I was going to be open and honest about that, I thought, I don't ever want to be in a closet again. I want to be open and direct for the rest of my life as much as I'm actually able to be. And so I made that very definite decision. And when I was depressed and people said, oh, well, what do you say to people? I said, I'm not going to lie about it. But I will tell you, when I'm not depressed, I can sit on this stage and talk to you all about depression. When I am depressed and I have to cancel an appointment, I suddenly hear myself saying to people, my stomach isn't right, I'm not going to be able to go on Wednesday. And I think this is ridiculous. Everyone knows about my depression. Everyone who knows me, I mean, knows about my depression. But it becomes much more difficult to admit to in those moments. I was very impressed by the courage of all of the people who talked to me. I interviewed 300 families for Far From the Tree. I interviewed dozens of people for The Noonday Demon, the depression book. And a lot of the time, as people told me these vulnerable stories, they seemed to be in a state of great pain, and it seemed very hard for them to talk about it. And I kept saying to people, why did you decide to sit down and talk to me today? And time and again, people said, I felt so alone in these experiences, and if talking to you has the potential to make someone else feel less alone, then I'm willing to do it even though it's difficult. And I felt that was an extraordinary courage that they had in putting their own vulnerability into the hands of someone they didn't really know, and ultimately into the hands of a wide public they would never meet.
Martianos.
Thank you. Martians. I imagine you will have many questions, actually, and perhaps possibly an experience to tell from colleagues in your high school, classmates in the university, similar stories, actually fruits that fell far from the tree. Does anyone want to break the ice? I'm very sorry, Mr. Solomon, but I'm going to ask my question in Spanish. I apologize. I don't know how the education system works in the US, but here in Spain, we don't have anything such as emotional education or education of the feelings. We have no subjects that deal with this. Do you think it would be good to introduce such a subject so that they can help us deal with that? Thank you, Antonia.
To answer your question in English, and wish I could answer it in Spanish instead. You know, I think that traditionally that question of how we talk about these large abstract questions has come partly from reading poetry and philosophy. It's come partly from the church and from the halls of religion, and it's come partly from the dynamics of a family talking to one another at home. Since writing these books, I've discovered how many people there are who are living with these difficult experiences and who don't have any language for them. And I've also discovered how alone people are. I get letters all the time from people who describe lives in which they have some sort of job, they get home from their job, they buy food on the way home, they eat in front of the television, they go to sleep, they never interact with anyone. And partly they never interact with anyone because they can't explain any of what matters to them or what is important to them. Whether you could teach that as a subject in school sort of directly, I don't know. But it's striking to me that psychology is something that mostly you can't study until you get to be at university. And I actually think it's a good thing to start studying when you're very, very little. And one of the things that I've done with my own children, or have tried at least to do with my own children, is to talk to them all the time about their feelings, and sometimes they get really annoyed by it, and they don't want to talk about their feelings, and they want to talk about whether they were able to go sledding today, or whether they got a goal when they were playing ball, and I'm happy to talk about those subjects too. But I think the best place to learn that is at home, and then the second best place to learn it is from books, and is from books in which you sort of say, oh, there's what I felt put into words. But it's not exactly what I felt, and then you begin to come up with your own words. So I think the study of literature can be a way in.
So My next question would be, nowadays we know a lot more about depression and other diseases, so it's easier to talk about them. And people, almost everyone knows about a little about them. So do you think depression is being trivialized by society nowadays because we all know about them? And how do you distinguish between being sad, just sad, or have a bad day from a truly depression?
We suffer from a terrible poverty of most languages, including both English and Spanish, which is that the word depression gets used to describe how a child feels on the day when it rains and he was supposed to be playing outside, and to describe how someone feels standing on a bridge in the moment before she jumps. And I think it's very important that we recognize the cost of that poverty of language, which is that when someone is suffering from the serious syndrome of depression, there will be people around saying, I get depressed sometimes myself. What I do is I go for a good walk, I get up right now, and they start giving you all of this advice. If you only got massage therapy, you'd be fine. Sometimes massage therapy can help, but people don't really understand the sort of difference. And it's difficult because it's a difference, in some ways, a difference of degree. Because the way that you feel after a mild disappointment and the way that you feel in intractable despair are kind of on a spectrum, and there isn't a clear point at which you can say, with, pneumonia. You have pneumonia or you don't have pneumonia. The virus is in there or it's not in there. The bacteria are a problem. I mean, it's clear, and with depression it's not clear. I think that there are some people who, in connection with that, have trivialized the experience of depression, and I think that that can come at a very severe cost. But I also think that the greater openness and people's greater willingness to acknowledge that they have the problem means that more people will seek treatment. And while depression is a ghastly, debilitating, horrible condition, it is in most instances also one that can be treated and one that can be helped. And if people are able to be open about the experience they're having, the likelihood of their getting better is vastly increased. So some trivializing, but I think mostly we've moved in a good direction.
Well, after writing about the difficulties and problems that families with disabled children have to afford, you decided to have children, to be a father. And wasn't this decision contradictory for you? How and why did you decide this? Thank you.
Lots of people said to me when I decided about halfway through writing this book that I was going to have children, and people said to me, how can you be deciding to have children in the middle of a book about everything that can go wrong? And I had to say over and over again, but it's really not a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how much joy there can be in the experience, even when everything seems to be going wrong. And I thought if all of these parents could love all of these children under all of these difficult circumstances, then I think I'm going to be able to love whatever children I have. Now, the structure of my family is in many ways quite unusual. My husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. My best friend from college and I had talked for a long time about the fact that she wanted to have children after her divorce, and we decided to have a daughter. And mother and daughter, and now the mother's male partner, live in Texas, but visit often. And then John and I, my husband and I, wanted to have a child who was with us full time, so we have my son George. And I am the biological father, and we had an egg donor, and the surrogate who carried the pregnancy was Laura, the lesbian mother of John's 2 biological children. So it's sort of 6 parents, 4 children, 3 states. And I used to wonder all the time, when I first realized gay people actually could have children, I thought, but will it be weird for them to grow up this way? And will it be hard on the children to know that they come from a family that isn't this conventional family? And I will now tell a slightly self-congratulatory story, and I hope you'll forgive me. but when I turned 50 last year, my family had a birthday party for me, and halfway through the party, my son, the youngest of these 4 children, said to my husband that he wanted to make a little speech. And John said, "George, you're 4. You can't make a speech. Only Grandpa, Uncle David, and I are making speeches tonight." But George insisted, and John didn't want to have an argument in the middle of the party, and so he brought him up to the front of the room where there was a microphone, and there were about 200 people there, and George got there and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" And everyone was kind of startled and sat up, and George said, "I'm glad it's Daddy's birthday. I'm glad we all get cake, and Daddy, if you were little, I'd be your friend." And I thought, okay, all of those years, all of the concern, the bullying, the depression, whatever it was, I thought it's all actually fine in the end. There you are. That was a long answer to your question. Thank you.
Andrea?
Yes. Do you think it's more common to have depression when you don't have a lot of money, or maybe you're not like in the same range of society that have more money to live?
Well, the cliche for a long time was that you were more likely to be depressed if you did have a lot of money, and I make a very strongly felt argument in this book that that's not true. Depression results from a genetic or biological vulnerability that meets a triggering circumstance. And if you're very, very vulnerable, you need only a very slight trigger, and if you're less vulnerable, you need a bigger trigger. Now, we have to assume that the genetics and biology are fairly evenly distributed across the socioeconomic spectrum. And which life is actually more difficult and has more triggers? The life of someone who is economically impoverished and who is struggling to deal with paying the bills and never knows whether they'll be able to stay in their house next month and all the rest of those things that go with poverty. The difference is that if you essentially have a really very nice life, that you know intellectually is a very nice life, and you feel utterly miserable, you think, well, it's very strange that I feel so miserable. There must be something wrong with me. Maybe I'll see a doctor. Perhaps I have depression. If you have an unbelievably difficult, awful, miserable life, and you feel very upset and depressed, it doesn't occur to you that there's anything wrong with you because you think, well, of course I feel this way. It makes perfect sense with the life that I have. But in reality, it is often the case that you are not depressed because you are poor, but are rather poor in part because you are depressed. And when you're depressed, bettering your station in life, getting yourself an education, getting a better job, functioning well, is unbelievably difficult. So the problem we have is that there is a huge amount of depression among disadvantaged populations, and there is never adequate treatment given for it. And I feel very strongly that what we need to do is to create programs in which people are screened and people are diagnosed. Because when I looked at pilot projects that had been done by individual researchers who went into impoverished communities, found people who had not self-identified as depressed and treated them, the transformations that came about were absolutely astonishing. And there was one woman in particular whom I interviewed when she was first picked up, when she was in an abusive relationship with a terrible husband, and she said that she had nothing to say to her own children, and she was terrified of when they came home in the evenings, and I mean, she was completely going to pieces. And 6 months later, which is not very long, after taking some medication and having once a week group therapy, which is not very intensive, she had gotten out of the marriage. She had gotten a job working for the U.S. Navy, in fact. She had moved into a new apartment. Her children who had been dropping out were doing better. I mean, the transformation was really amazing. And I said to her, how do you describe this? What do you make of it? And she said, in reference to this researcher who had done the random screening, I prayed to the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. And I thought, there are so many people who are making that prayer, and there are so few angels going to see them.
Perdóneme, pero yo también le voy a
I also apologize, but I'm going to make my question in Spanish. In one of your conferences, you told that one of your first interviewees had defined depression as a slow way of being dead. Is that something that you would associate with depression being a lack of vitality? Could you go a bit further into this?
Who's in the depression book. It's a woman named Laura Anderson. She's actually the one who talked about being able to tolerate the evil in the world, but that was at the end of the book, and the slower way of being dead was at the beginning. She's had a tough road. She continues in many ways to have a tough road. I'm very much in touch with many of the people I've written about, and very close to Laura, whom I adore and whom I admire. She said, depression takes away whatever I liked about myself in the first place, which wasn't very much. It's really just a slower way of being dead. And I think there is that feeling when you're depressed that you don't see any point to anything. You don't feel that you are contributing anything, and neither do you feel that you're receiving anything. You have nothing to make other people feel better. There's nothing other people can do that makes you feel better. It's that sense of complete desolation, and you feel like, okay, I get out of bed, I put on my clothes, I eat something, I get back in bed, I take off my clothes. Well, usually I take off my clothes and then get back in bed, but when you're depressed, sometimes you get a little confused. But anyway, there's the overall feeling that there just is nothing that you're either giving or getting, and so it feels as though it's an idiotic dumb show, and you think, why am I even bothering? And that, I think, is that feeling that it's like a slow way of being dead. Now, I have sometimes said that if death were something that happened passively rather than actively, that it would be a very large part of the population who might be gone. Because Laura, at that point, felt very much that she didn't want to be alive, that she didn't feel that she had the energy and focus to go out and kill herself. She just wanted to give up. She just wanted to go to sleep and not wake up. And though there is a suicidal element to that, it's less forceful and less vigorous and less driven than suicide. It's just that closing down, that feeling as though you're inside an eggshell and nothing can get through to you there.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Any other questions, Martians? Max?
Going to the previous question, you think depression is associated to no fun in living? You don't want to live anymore. It's always like this, or there are cases you just feel depressed but not necessarily wanting to suicide?
Well, in the first place, wanting to commit suicide and wanting not to live anymore are two different things. Suicide is an action. Not wanting to live anymore is a passive state. So those shouldn't be conflated. But in addition to that, I think depression can manifest in many ways. I mean, one chapter of Far From the Tree is about people who commit crimes. And when I went out and interviewed criminals and they described their thinking over and over again, I thought, oh, I see. You're so depressed that you felt like you didn't even exist anymore, and committing an act of violence made you feel like you were alive again, and it was a way of dealing with depression. It is not a good way of dealing with depression, but it is a way of dealing with depression. It can manifest in so many different ways. You know, there are some people who, when they're depressed, are incredibly agitated and seem to be shaking with all the energy they have in them. There are some people who, when they're depressed, can barely manage to form a word or to say anything. I think it takes many different shapes, and I think that a lot of the time it's not so much I mean, the suicide, the actual suicidality is when it's painful to be alive. But I think the sense that it's pointless to be alive, I think that affects a large number of people much of the time. But I opened the book about depression. The opening sentence of it is, "Depression is the flaw in love." And what I meant by that is that in order to experience what we think of as the strong and positive emotions, we need to have the possibility of those dark and negative ones also always available. If I loved the person I'm married to, but thought, well, if he dies, I'll meet someone else, It wouldn't be love as we know it. My husband and son were in Madrid, and they had to go back today because George has school tomorrow. And, you know, I worried about them getting on the airplane and was relieved when I found out that the plane had landed and that they were okay. I feel like if you don't have that potential, that sense that there could be terrible loss, that sense that there could be pain and nullity and that life could come to seem pointless, then you would never fully experience the fulfillment and the joy and the sense of life having meaning. So clinical depression is a very extreme manifestation, and it's really an illness, and it's really terrible, but it's connected to a kind of complexity of range, which is part of what renders us as human beings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Si le parece, vamos a aprovechar porque tenemos algunas preguntas.
If you will, we're going to answer some questions that we're receiving through our hashtag, Vida Martes. David says, if you live day after day with someone who suffers depression, someone that was very close to you, how would you face it?
Above all, a disease of loneliness. And part of what happens when people are depressed is that they isolate themselves. And I'm often asked, what should I do about this depressed person I live with who keeps saying, just leave me alone? And what I find myself saying is, perhaps the person who's depressed needs you to be there so that you can talk about being depressed together. And perhaps talking is too stressful, and you need to just sit by the person's bed. And perhaps even being in a room with you is too stressful, and you have to sit right outside the door. But don't go any farther away than that. Because even though the depressed person feels incapable of sustaining his end or her end of the interaction, when you go away, that's when the sense of being alone, which is an internal reality, becomes also an external reality. And at that point, people plummet and fall apart. I also feel like if you are with someone who's depressed, you have to master an art of gentle persuasion. You can't say, pull yourself together, get out, you have to do things. Don't ask someone to dance on a broken leg. But you can say, and you do say, what about if you just had a little bit of soup? I think you'll feel better. Or you say, I know you don't want to go outside, but we're just going to walk once around the block and then come back, and you should be in the sun for a few minutes. And you need to keep gently encouraging someone. And perhaps most of all, you need to say to someone, the condition you have is a treatable condition, and you need to see people and try to find that treatment. So I think it's important to stay engaged with the person, to stay encouraging, to stay present, and not to be scolding or critical or trying to fix the problem on grounds that this is how you would do it if it were your problem. It's not your problem, it's their problem, and they have to do it their own way.
Eva
Represa just asked another question, which is communication the first step and the essential element to cure depression?
An important step. You know, different people respond to different things, and different people have different abilities. Some people, if they only have enough support and encouragement, can really express their inner reality. And some people with all of the support and encouragement in the world can't express their inner reality. Or if they can express it, they express it, as someone was saying actually in the green room earlier, they express it through tears or fighting rather than through words. I think the ability to communicate is ultimately what makes people feel less alone. And I've talked now a lot about this question of loneliness, and I think it's very important to undertake that. But I don't want to make a fetish out of communication. For me, it's incredibly central. Obviously, my life is much of it in words, and that's why I write books. I think what's important is understanding, and I think communication is one of many routes that may lead to understanding.
Seguimos con las preguntas que nos...
Let's continue answering those questions that they're asking through Twitter using the hashtag Vida Martes. Javier Cantera, he's wondering, why do we have to define depression? Why don't we just limit out what depression is not?
Depression is a good first step to being able to wrestle with it and to treat it. I think if you haven't come up with any definition for depression, that that people haven't been defined as having it, and they won't seek the treatments that could help them. And I think that when you have, I'll give you a sort of maybe a better answer to that, which is actually going to draw not from depression, but from some work I did with someone who has schizophrenia, who's in the chapter on schizophrenia in Far From the Tree. And she described how she had years of terrible psychosis and delusions and so on. And then she said she finally was brought into the place where she was well treated and where she got better. And she said, I met Dr. Klagsbrun, and he gave me my diagnosis. And when I realized there was a name for what was happening to me, when I realized it was something that had happened to other people, that people had studied, that you could work with, that it had a name and that it was a thing, that was the first step to my recovering. And I think that happens in depression as well. You think, oh, that's what it is. It's this syndrome. It happens to a lot of people. There's a lot of wisdom about it. It's not me. It's not just that I have decayed. It's that I'm dealing with something. I chose to use the word demon in the title of the book because a demon is something that comes and invades you and that hopefully and theoretically you can then get back out of you. It's not an essential piece of you. And I think when we define depression, that what we do is say to people, you are a self and you are dealing with this terrible difficulty. And that terrible difficulty may intersect with yourself, but it doesn't take its place. It isn't the same thing.
Lo cierto es que usted nos habla siempre de...
Truth be told, you always talk about physical things, right? Deformities, problems of all kinds, depressions. But I can read in you the importance of faith. Could you elaborate on this idea? Where is faith? Do we have to have faith in God or on what?
Entirely for myself, I'm a great believer in the importance of moral questions, and I'm a great believer in the idea that our existence is highly mysterious and that all the science that we'll come up with for the rest of humanity will never really explain why we're here or what life means. So I have a great faith in mystery, and I have considerable discomfort with dogma. I have had a mix of a Jewish and a Christian upbringing. I have elements of both. Having said that, when my husband and I got married, we had both a rabbi and a minister because we wanted to acknowledge that what we were looking at was something larger than simply the legal set of arrangements that we were embarking on. I have found that there are many people for whom a very explicit faith has an extraordinary and redemptive quality. People who will say that they know that God has a purpose for them in their struggle with depression, in their having a child with a disability, in whatever challenges they may face. And it gives them an extraordinary serenity, which allows them to be accepting of what's happened to them rather than in a state of perpetual rage and anger about it. I've also known people who in depression have felt that they were abandoned by God, or people who have had children who had many, many problems and have felt that somehow religion gives them no explanation. But in a way, one of the most moving conversations I had when I worked on Far From the Tree was with actually the family in which the mother said that extraordinary thing at the funeral about being twice robbed. But when their child was born and they discovered he had these problems, she said, I immediately felt I wanted to have him christened. And her husband said, but we've never been very religious. He said, I don't mind if you want to do that, but why? And she said, I didn't know why then. But years afterwards, I understood that it was a way of affirming that he too had a soul and that he too was a human being and that he too was beloved of God. She said, and I didn't understand that was what it was, but it made an enormous difference. I think there are many kinds of faith that people have. I think people having faith of some kind in one another can also be very powerful. I think for some people, faith in science and medicine can be very powerful. I think that sense of being able to rely on something larger and more complex and more profound than one's own tangled inner reality is transformative for people, and that in some sense, in all of those variations from God on down, that process of faith is part of what gives people the impetus, the motive to deal with the difficulties they face.
Nos siguen entrando nuevas.
We are still getting questions. Adeka is indeed saying, what is the first step towards helping someone who suffers depression that does not acknowledge that has a depression but displays all the symptoms?
That's a question that I get all the time, and it's a situation that I've confronted on many occasions. It's very difficult to do. I could give you some easy advice. I could say give them a copy of my book and make them read it. But I think that what you really need to do with someone like that is to attempt to address the symptoms that are expressly manifest, and to say, gee, you seem to be tired all the time. I wonder whether there's anything that we could do that would help you have a little more energy. Or to say to someone, I know you see everything in this very tragic light, but it may not be so bad, and to be patient and to lead people there very gradually. People who don't want to admit that they have depression mostly don't want to admit it because they think it's a failure, it's a weakness, it's a shortcoming. What you need to do is bit by bit, slowly and carefully introduce the idea that actually it isn't a weakness and it isn't a shortcoming. And introduce also the idea that while people suppose that it's very courageous to fight whatever their problems are on their own, that often what's very courageous is to actually admit that the problems are there and to seek some kind of help for them. But of course, it varies from situation to situation, and some people can talk about it, and some people can't. And sometimes, I have a friend actually who's a brilliant doctor. She's Irish. Her mother comes from a very conservative background, was clearly suffering from serious depression, and finally, after years of trying to get her mother to deal with it, she said to her mother, it seems you have these really terrible allergies, and I'm going to give you some medication for your allergies. She gave her antidepressants, and her mother's been in great shape ever since.
Siguen entrando más preguntas.
We continue to get questions. I want to quote Eva Represa. She is asking, have you researched the relationship between art and the way it could help people that suffer depression, of course?
Of art a great deal, and actually the illustration for the cover of my depression book in the original edition, which was an image I had chosen, was a Goya engraving of the Colossus sitting on the edge of the world, because I think Goya is incredibly powerful in his depiction of depression. I think there's a great deal in literature and in poetry that you read and you recognize it. There's an Emily Dickinson poem which I recited at the opening of a TED Talk I did about depression, and I think I won't do it here as it's getting late, but it's a poem called I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, and it ends, just then a plank in reason broke, and I fell down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. And it's a very powerful description of just that sense of the monumental horror of it and the way that you descend into it. I think that those descriptions often will allow people who haven't recognized that they're depressed to say, oh yes, that's what it is. They look at the painting, or they hear a piece of music, or one of these things, and I think, oh, there it is. And I think sometimes in seeing it expressed by someone else, you get great relief from it. I had a conversation just yesterday with someone, with a journalist here in Spain, who said, when you're depressed, tell me a piece of music you like to listen to. And I said, you know, often when I'm depressed, I listen to the end part of Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet. I said, it's a ballet, I know it's a little cliched, but I find it moving. She said, but that's such a sad piece of music. And I said, okay, but if you're depressed, it isn't that what you need is to cheer up by looking at sort of something pretty or hearing something boppy. I mean, sometimes that's helpful, and, you know, there are times when ABBA is really what's needed. But a lot of the time what you really need is the recognition and the feeling of sort of that you're sharing the sadness with someone else. And I think art and literature can penetrate that veil of isolation.
Y si le parece, le voy a hacer una última pregunta.
If you allow me, I'm going to ask you a last question from Empower. It's a reference to the value of loss. And he's asking, is depression a way to learn to integrate all the facets of life, almost gains and losses?
I think that loss can be among life's most exquisite experiences. And I use the word exquisite in English, which really has two connotations. You talk about something being exquisite when you want to convey that it's unbelievably beautiful. But you also talk about exquisite pain, meaning it's so extreme, it's so sharp, it's so intolerable, you're experiencing this sort of agony. And I think that sense of the exquisite is there a lot in pain. I mean, as I said, that's this thing that many people end up being grateful for experiences they didn't want to have. And, you know, you can feel that it's all been very transformative while it's in the past tense. I'm glad, in many ways, that I dealt with depression, that I dealt with the issues about growing up as a gay person, that I dealt with all of this stuff then. But if you said to me, oh, that was so meaningful, would you like to have some more very painful experiences now? I would say, actually, thank you, I would just as soon not. And so I think that we tend to cast that light in which we can say, depression is what unifies things, is what gives everything coherence afterwards. Afterwards, it can do all those terrific things. During, it feels pretty hollow and barren and empty and desolate. But I do think that there is a tendency in the world at large now for us to conform to what I called in the book about depression, to the idea of a kind of psychic supermodel. And in the same way people have said that these sort of unbelievably beautiful women who show up all over the place in the media cause ordinary women sometimes to feel very bad about their bodies, or ordinary men, that in the same way there is a portrayal in the media, in advertising, in the sort of national dialogue throughout the Western world, there is this idea somehow that there are all of these people who are succeeding and who have marriages that work and whose hair always looks fantastic and who are in one way or another kind of really on top of things, and we compare ourselves to them and we feel terrible about ourselves because we aren't rising up to that level. And I think that's as dangerous as I think the emaciated supermodels are to people with real bodies. So I think when you look at those models that you somehow lose the sense that actually all lives contain an emotional spectrum, and that some people seem to find great contentment in a narrow spectrum, but not many manage to achieve it, and that for far more people, ultimately meaning resides in keeping the spectrum extremely wide. And if you want it to be a wide spectrum, it's going to be wide at both ends.
Andrew Solomon, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon. Just before we leave, just a reminder, everything that we discussed, even what we felt here, you will be able to retrieve on our webpage, in Fundación Telefónica's webpage. because possibly many of these ideas deserve a second round, a second listen, and a second inner processing. I hope you enjoyed everything. I hope you enjoyed as much as Rojo and I enjoyed this session, and I really hope that you learned something thanks to Solomon's experience. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patience, Mr. Solomon. The interpreter wishes you a nice evening.